Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to some. Welcome to Cool.World. It's disrupting data distribution for Indigenous audiences and allies today. That's what our webinar is going to be about. I'm Leena Minifie. I'm a digital strategist and producer in Vancouver, BC, on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I just want to offer thanks for allowing me to be here back and forth for many years. Thank them for having to steward and care for these lands and waters since time immemorial, and they're still doing the hard work today. And I'm in relation with many members and nations for a long time. So I'm Simshian, I'm Giswoodwada, House of Wida Lee. My clan is Killer Whale from Northern BC. I'd like to also acknowledge the support from Canada Council for the Arts and our partner, ImagineNATIVE Film and Media Arts Festival. Thank you so much for supporting the work that we're doing here today. I wanted to introduce our speakers. We have some exciting speakers. I don't think, as I said to them earlier, I don't think it's been done before, having Indigenous women and Black women together talking about digital strategies, media strategies, and reaching our audiences online. So today we have Marylou Mintram from Raining Storm Productions, who is a producer, writer, and the co-owner of Raining Storm Productions. We have Jade Begay, who's an organizer, a filmmaker, a media strategist. She's on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and NDN Collective, and a climate justice campaign director there. And we also have Delphine Lievens, who's from Gower Street Analytics, who's been lifting up sort of racialized media and thinking about where our stories go globally for BIPOC people and racialized people. She's in London, UK, and she joins us. But first of all, we'll start with Adriana Chartrand, who generously have been our co-presenters here. So Adriana Chartrand is ImagineNATIVE Institute Manager, who will let us know a bit about the organization, the amazing work you guys have done. I've been a long-term visitor and also basically screened every single short film I've done in ImagineNATIVE. So long-time supporter since the early 2000s. Can you tell us a bit more about the organization?
Yeah, I sure can, Leena. Thanks so much for that introduction and for having me here today. As Leena mentioned, my name is Adriana Chartrand. I'm currently the Institute Manager for ImagineNATIVE for one more day, and then moving on to a role with Telefilm. It's a wonderful, wonderful organization. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of sort of how it fits into, the idea of data and distribution in the Indigenous industry. Leena mentioned screening her shorts here. So the exhibition of Indigenous films is quite a big part of distribution in our industry because we don't get a lot of theatrical releases or, VOD releases. Screening on the festival circuit is a very important form of distribution. So ImagineNATIVE has been a leader in that sense. For the entire time it's existed, the 22 years, I believe, 21, 22 years. So that's a very important role that it plays. We also do things like we have a tour that we take to different communities or different cities of films that played and won awards usually at our festival that year. So we're getting the distribution of those films out to more remote communities as well and to a wider audience in that way. And we also work to build capacity in the industry through our professional development programs, which I've been overseeing through the industry. We have a ton of those, including some producer programs that involve international marketplaces, so setting up market screenings in those markets and also introducing producers to the market and sort of how that business world works. So we've got our hands in a lot of stuff. We are an international festival, so we accept and screen film, TV, video, VR works from Indigenous people globally. It's not just Canada or North America. So we have a lot of very strong national and international networks and relationships. And yeah, I think that's about it. Unless you think there's anything else I should be adding, Leena.
I'm curious about, defining Indigenous audiences. I'm going to read out our learning objectives
Sure.
before we finish here. But ImagineNATIVE has been helping sort of define Indigenous audience and sort of almost training Canada and US about who Indigenous audiences are, what we sort of consume, what we like to see, seeing ourselves on screen. Is there anything you think about as part of the Indigenous audience and allies that's sort of unique at ImagineNATIVE?
Yeah, I think because we have sort of different strategies for bringing the work to people, and because we create an Indigenous-led space to present the work in, I think we've really, our audience has been always the first priority. You know, that's where the festival has built from, and it's been, you know, primarily Indigenous. Or at the beginning, I would say it was definitely primarily Indigenous. I don't know the actual stats now, but there's definitely still lots of Indigenous people who attend, and that's who we really look to. So we have kind of always responded to the wants and needs of our audience in that way, and that's helped us to sort of define how Indigenous people want to consume media, and also, you know, how to responsibly exhibit media that might be dealing with very, you know, sensitive and emotional issues, and how to ensure that the presentation, the exhibition, sort of every aspect of dealing with the artist is done in like a meaningful, respectful way and is coming from our Indigenous values. So really just sort of returning to those values and looking to our audience to sort of define for us what they want and need to see.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited, and congratulations on your new ventures forward. Always a privilege to talk to people at ImagineNATIVE. You guys do so much. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me and inviting me, Leena, and have a great webinar. I'm sorry I can't stay, but it's going to be awesome.
Okay, wonderful. See you. So ImagineNATIVE has been pretty incredible about bridging the gap between allies and Indigenous people as well, and really doing community events and impact through taking films from ImagineNATIVE and curating them and getting them out to community events and places across either the north or in rural areas, to peoples in traditional territories. So that's also part of the impact campaign stuff they've done that made big impact in community. So I just want to get back to why we're doing this salon and what are the learning outcomes that we expect during this webinar, and what you guys can sort of hopefully glean from what we're doing. So I think the first thing and outcome that I would like to see is that we're going to kind of decolonize niche markets and what that means, to be specific and named audiences, not just general ones that we sort of give, you know, broadcasters and funders. So sometimes they offer things as in general, like female or male, this age to that age. We're going to try to really dig down to what they call niche markets, which is more BIPOC or IBPOC, Indigenous or LGBTQ2S, those kind of markets, to be specific in names. We were going to go over best practices for building an online presence and following. So we have some of the major players here who've been doing that, either marketing or reaching audiences or building 100,000 audiences, and they're here today with you. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We're going to empower Indigenous creators and allies, hopefully with comfort in using marketing, digital marketing terms for digital strategy and film marketing, and break that down a bit. We're going to identify challenges and barriers for Indigenous media and content on social media, what we face right now, and there's always new barriers throttling our content, so we'll get into those terms later. To understand how to define our audiences, that's a really big portion here. More and more grants are asking us to define them, and we'll go over some of the grants at the end that sort of are asking for these things. We'll have examples of audiences' interests and how to target different social networks and different movements in order to get your media art pieces, your films, your moving images, whatever medium you'd like to call it, and get it out to the world on digital with this disruption right now. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's going to be our guest. We're going to be asking questions and digging deep into some answers from experts. So Marylou Mintram is a producer and a writer and the co-owner of Raining Storm Productions. And we're going to start with you today, Marylou, and ask some big topic questions and see if we can pull things out. What are the key barriers, do you think, and challenges that Indigenous media makers face in the current social media climate right now? Oh, I think you have to hit the button, or our tech is going to have to
No, that was me. Sorry. I was just saying thank you for having me. It's really great to be involved in this type of discussion because you're right, we don't have very many places or spaces to be able to gather and really look at how, as Indigenous people, we're looking at being effective and building digital strategies for various capacities for reaching to our audiences. So I love to be able to explore that more. But before I get into that, Tansa, my name is Marylou Mintram. I'm Nidawin from Nisqually Cree Nation, which is located in Treaty 5 territory. I'm currently living and residing in the unceded territory of Algonquin people in Ottawa. And we'll be relocating to Toronto in the next month, which is exciting.
Wow.
But thank you for having this space to be able to talk about what are some key barriers or challenges for Indigenous media makers in our current media landscape, right? So, and I think if you just kind of generally looking at how we use social media, digital technologies, it's grown rapidly. It's ever changing. Like even in this pandemic, we can see trends that have shifted. So we have to be on top of what those are. But if you look at among Indigenous communities, we do face some social disadvantage, and the biggest disadvantage is accessibility in terms of having access to Wi-Fi or even technology, like the tech that we actually use. And being able to stay connected. But one of the other reasons, if we want to take it a little bit step further, is one of the biggest barriers or challenges is utilizing and how to effectively understand the power of analytic practice, and which is what we're going to dive deeper into today. The use of internal and external data collection, and how to uncover and quantifiable data or connections between the audiences that we want to connect to, and how can we grow and provide a shared experience of knowledge or transfer of knowledge. So there's many things to connect on those things.
Yeah, it's connecting and sharing numbers is so important. And myself, because I was working on Indian Horse, the Grizzlies, Monkey Beach, helping those get to #1 in the box office, I try to share that data as much as possible. We try to collect numbers so we can prove that there's an audience and a want and a need. And I think it's really important to keep that open amongst each other and use it much of that. But if you want to define a few of those things, though, too, like you said, analytics, but if you can just give us a couple examples of what analytics are for the audience that may not know.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Social media is multi-locational, right? So there are many social media networks, different platforms that allow you to stay connected with each other, with movies, with interests, with social issues, with
geography.
Exactly. So having an understanding of what those platforms are, then you need to connect of how can I put together a robust framework for measuring and improving social media experience, because it is experience. It is looking at how can I operationally look at the performance. How am I building on the experience of the people that I want to connect with and measuring that, right? So we use this terms of KPI, right? What is the key performance indicators? And being aware of what those KPIs are, so you can connect directly with your target group, with your audience that you want to build those experiences with, and allow them to go and journey with you as you go.
Yeah, and follow you to your place. So what are these? And then we were talking about places, because they exist in the digital world, and sometimes our analytics break them down in real geography, where people are positioned in their homes, where they're living. That's how their IPs connect. It's like they're from a different province or city. You can kind of see that those data and those numbers or those analytics. But where are the top places digitally to go to find Indigenous content online? What's working now during the pandemic?
Good questions. Using, like I said before, using social media is ever changing. Even in this pandemic, we see trends change. The reason why people are interacting on social media has changed because of the pandemic. Yeah. So these emerging trends and activity, we'll call them activity, how is it directly related to what you're trying to bring forward through your various channels or your platforms, your social media networks, right? And how is it connecting to what your audience deems as important, right? How are we being on top of those trends and recognizing that there is potential there? Using social media and digital technologies for communications, providing information as part of creating, as part of responding to social change, but also understanding how, if we can take it a little bit further, understanding how Indigenous people use digital technologies and social media, at the same time being aware of your positive and negative impacts on how we connect, right? Because there's also that to take into consideration. So, but if you look at more closely of your audience and how and why Indigenous people use social media, what is currently being used, right? And where are they? We see, yeah.
So let's talk about those trends right now, like things we've seen. So I'd say that, TikTok right now, and Dave was just on BAMF, so we're talking about this, but they are amplifying Indigenous youth that are on TikTok for all of National Indigenous History Month. So there's a lot of youth using that for teaching, like hashtag education, hashtag comedy, performance, whatever. So there's a huge amount of people going over and youth being sort of amplified in that realm. We know that Facebook is kind of the starting place for everybody. So our grandmas, our aunties, our uncles, our cousins, if you want to, it's the biggest family demographic. They're usually on Facebook. The youth like to go to their own private place, Instagram. So they like to be away from grandma and auntie sometimes so they can be with their own peers. Same with, there's a Snapchat wave there too. But they like to sort of talk to each other and sort of be amongst their peers. And Instagram also has been has seen an uptake by older people during the demographic, which I think bums the youth out sometimes. So, so there's that. And then Twitter, I think a lot of, I'm just going over where I think I see the demographics in my work, but Twitter also, it seems like a lot of our writers, our journalists, our academics, our social issue people, as well as like our main advocates and advocacy people, are there sort of sharing every day. So, so just in that, there's a lot of variance and nuance where they exist. But when you were working sort of on marketing Indigenous media and content, as you've done in the past and are still going to be doing in your producing, with your producing role hat, what do you find doesn't work? Like, what do you find like you've gone in and you've tried something and it's sort of not work right now or in the past?
And that's a very good question. In terms of what doesn't work, well, I think we need to be aware that all these social media networks, I noticed when we first started to mobilize or be very present or apparent in these spaces, several of the locations stopped comments. Right? So, and to continue dialogue on those things because of the fact there's negative aspects of social media and in terms of like cyberbullying, cyber racism, explicit content and things like that between. So it's understanding how to deal with things even from a community level too, right? So being aware of those big picture trends, but also being aware of the impacts and the messaging, right, that we connect to these the content that we're building. So
the messages, framing messages to your key audiences is gold. Yeah,
is really important. And just to kind of also touch one other thought to what you were saying, you know, Gen Zers have this, their young people are connecting a lot more and are more versed to how to use these platforms. And they're also, as a result, Gen Z members tend to be more open, like more liberal leaning and actively engaged in advocating for fair and equitable treatment of others. And you can see that happening a lot in the content that they're producing, and strong like identity or cultural connections, which is so empowering and so encouraging.
Well, thank you. We're going to come back to you in about 15 minutes and sort of get deeper into this. So I'm going to bring up Jade Begay now, who I introduced, is from NDN Collective, doing amazing things. You're a multimedia producer, a filmmaker, a communications professional. You've been helping with campaigns, media, you know, making films for a long time. You can also introduce yourself if you'd like to, where you are at and your location.
Thanks, Leena. So can you hear me? I just want to make sure that mic is working and all of that good stuff. Cool. So good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're located. I'm calling in from my ancestral homelands here in northern New Mexico, Oga, as we call it, White Shell Place, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And you did a great intro there. I won't go over my roles, but I am Tesuque Pueblo and Dene, as well as Southern Ute. And what else is there to say? I think
I could just go, you know, doing all of that. That's a lot of work. But what does your work consist of? Just like a day-to-day, just to know, because this is a place where we're having to build talent.
Yeah.
And what does it look like to do the work that you do?
Yeah, so maybe I can talk about like kind of how I ended up here and the kind of story there. So my evolution as a media and communication strategist have led me to where I am now, where I lead, as you mentioned, the climate justice campaign at NDN Collective. And so in that role, in addition to advocacy and legislative work and on the ground, like grassroots and frontline organizing, I do a lot of narrative work to really center Indigenous peoples as the leaders in the climate justice field. So we work really on defining what climate justice means for Indigenous communities and peoples at the local and national level. And so we strategize on how those messages are seen at the highest levels of decision making when it comes to climate plans and policies. And then, in addition to that work, in my so-called spare time, I try to keep my passion around filmmaking and multimedia alive. That's really my background. I was raised as an art kid by my parents. Both my parents are artists. Shout out to them. And was raised in the center, Santa Fe. You know, it's center of, at least down here and below the medicine line, we have Indian Market here, so it's a big hub for Indigenous art.
And people don't know, that's where I met you. I was living in Santa Fe for 4.5 years. Able to go that way.
Yeah, AIA is here. My mom was a curator at the museum and also worked at the college. So really was embedded in that world as a youngster. I really try to keep that part of my life active and alive, doing film work. I went to film school. I started out in documentary film and then moved into communications and then found myself here where I am now. So yeah, I from time to time will work on films, short films in the documentary space primarily. Right now I'm working on a film about lithium mining and its relationship to the quote unquote green revolution and how, just the impacts of, as we build this green revolution, electrifying our cities and towns and building solar solutions, like those minerals have to come from somewhere. And so how are we not creating more extractive economies by, building so-called solutions? And then I also direct an AR VR project called Blood Memory, which maybe we can drop a link to in the chat. And then lastly, because my work sits in the intersections of environmental, cultural, Indigenous rights, and so on, I write about these connections a lot. And I'm not a trained journalist or a trained writer, but I really do try to share my perspective of the modern experience of, being an Indigenous person working at the forefront of these issues. And so I also see myself as a narrative change activist, really working to end erasure of our people.
Thank you for that. And a lot of these terms, I'm going to pull them out because they're big and they mean a lot and they have a lot of context to them. But narrative change is essentially sort of like taking stories away from sort of this, from if it was history, like being centered on white male experience. Narrative change is like making sure there's a different lens and that's being honored. So I just want to define some of these things for people. So, but a lot of this language, like narrative change and digital strategy, a lot of this pulls out from the campaigning world, the political campaigning world. But now it can be used in sort of film promotion and film marketing. And digital campaigning in the USA, I'm going to say it, is 10 years ahead of us. I work back and forth in between the two. But can you tell us a bit about how that the digital campaign, the digital strategy, finding those people online and making political change, how does it intersect with filmmaking and online promotion? How can we learn from that?
Definitely. So as we heard from our previous speaker, we all know that trends on social media, video, and digital platforms now pretty much go hand in hand. Video is like a primary way of showing our stories. And to me, when I think of how this format and these tools really became like popularized for especially our movement work, was during the Standing Rock movement. I think that really solidified for our Indigenous community down here that video plus digital strategy is a way to quickly visibilize our righteous struggles, the things that we're fighting for in our communities, and oftentimes very like rural and very out in near our territories, near our reservations, and if we're lucky to get a signal, then it's really one of the most effective ways to get our stories amplified and visibilized.
And that's why that's where they're blocking them at Standing Rock, blocking our cell phones.
Unless they're blocking. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
I would say. But yeah, so Island Lemoore kind of started that. So that was when I was campaigning and doing Island Lemoore, and Standing Rock really took off on all those. It went way farther, like international, global, universal, and in that experience. And you were actually making media pieces and cutting pieces from there too in your work. So tell us about the success of building that online following. Can you tell us about how that happened? Because it was millions and millions. Like Island Lemoore had like 100,000, 200,000, went up to 500,000, but you guys went like millions and millions of viewers who are investing and wanting to be part of it.
Yeah, I think in regard to that specific work, so at the time I was working, I think you mentioned, but also my audio is a little choppy for whatever reason. So I think you mentioned that work in relation to Indigenous rising media, and yeah, I think. I guess I reflect back and I think about the success really being related to the fact that 5 years ago, there wasn't really like a whole lot of Indigenous content creators. I mean, we were like sprinkled throughout, but like we weren't like producing content like the way we are now. So I think we really came in at this really prime moment in time where the world was really like, trying to look for Indigenous content and kind of, for us by, and also our people were looking for that content that was really like for us by us, and so I think at that time we just came in and filled that need, and that and really our content resonated with the folks that we were really trying to communicate with, which was our own people, trying to mobilize them. So yeah, I think a part of our success was that timing, and I think that's something to think about when you're designing campaigns or creating a film or media. Like how are you timing your content with things that dates that matter to our folks? So that can be something that can be integrated into like your impact plan on how you launch or release content. But yeah, I think we just filled that need of telling like revolutionary stories from our perspective as Indigenous peoples rapidly, and we hit a good stride at that time, and it really resonated.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you more. I'm going to ask you to brag a little more and tell us about. It's very traditional to brag, right? Tell us about your success with Indigenous media and Rising and the NDN Collective. Both of those have 100,000 followers at least in their social networks. Can you tell us about just any tips or things you learned to kind of take it to that massive scale and that grand scale?
Yeah, I would say that, building on what the previous speaker was talking about around just really paying attention to trends, that has been super helpful in just kind of getting that or like maintaining a good following, maintaining a strong audience. I think one of the fun things about both those platforms, keeping them moving and keeping them really active, is that I really got to, and my team too, I didn't do this alone, right? So I think our team really just got to play with like our modern like culture and euphemisms, and really lean into those fun aspects of who we are, and create content like around the messages that we share with ourselves, and really building on like Indigenous humor. I think that is something that has been really helpful in keeping our channels really active. But yeah, I think the main thing, and we continue to see this play out really well for like TikTok influencers and other like native social media influencers, is just that it's just that really like honest, raw, for us bias, for bias type of content that really sticks and really gets turned into the viral content that we end up all seeing. So yeah, I think leaning into that authentic and unique storytelling and perspective that we have.
Thank you for that. And I want to talk about, you guys help other people so much too. So NDN Collective's role is to outreach and assist in sort of social issues online. That's helping all of our issues and other Native organizations and Native nonprofits to kind of lift. But can you talk about what it's like to amplify other people's content and sort of pass the mic?
I mean, you know, I think at the heart of it, you know, and specifically thinking about like our relatives up north, I mean, at the heart of it is we don't believe in colonial borders. So when we do our work, we don't believe in silos. So when we do our work, especially when it comes to, you know, my area, like climate and racial justice, we want to include voices from other nations, you know, also, tribal nations, and also other, you know, colonial nations, and just making sure that we're being good relatives in that way. We're really happy to pass the mic and just like hand over our channel. We've done that multiple times over the course of the year, especially with the uprisings that took place down here in the U.S. All last summer, there were the uprisings around Black Lives Matter. We did a whole, it was like a week-long series where we just, passed the mic over to some of our Black, Indigenous, and Black relatives who just were able to kind of break down, you know, that moment and share their perspective. And we had no agenda. We had no, you know, this is the conversation we want to have. It was really up to those folks to share what they wanted to share, and again, educate and speak to our audience, but also with that type of collaboration, really just demonstrating what solidarity is, getting out of this, like, what is Black Indigenous solidarity? Well, it's passing the mic. It's just practicing it. So those are some ways that we like to, cross-pollinate and share knowledge and information.
Thank you for sharing the mic literally and sharing the story of you guys amplifying. I think it's good to know for filmmakers and media makers that we can rely on each other's networks. We don't have to just go it alone sometimes.
Yeah.
So always build in other nonprofits or organizations that are kind of amplifying or sharing the network. I know we have some in Canada that do this as well, like ICA, Indigenous Climate Action Network. And there's people there that would love to help out, I think, with film content and media. So we're kind of running out of time, but I really would like to dig in because your brain is digital and media strategy and how things get out, how they get seen. And you're always sort of in the back end ads, and I'm sure doing a lot of things. There are things that are in our way now, right? Especially after the US election, things online that are deemed and defined like too political. And of course, being born Indigenous is being political, ultimately. What are things that throttle content more and more these days, and how are you dealing with it as a strategist?
Yeah, well, I think just being mindful of what those are. So like you said, you know, there's these policies now on platforms that can kind of drown out or silence our content. One interesting example that took place actually really recently was, it was a big barrier, and it was also a big shock to be like, what? Why is this happening? I'm forgetting the dates, but it was early in May of this year, so about a month ago, a little more than a month ago, on the MMIW plus Two-Spirit Plus National Recognition Day here in the U.S., a lot of our posts were being taken down. I think mostly on Instagram, but I think some folks were experiencing posts being deleted on Facebook as well.
On May 5th,
May 5th, and that happened at the same time as this day was federally acknowledged as like a federal holiday or a federal day of recognition. And so just the contradiction there was really, like I said, kind of jarring. It felt like in one way we were being acknowledged, and in another way we were totally being erased. And so, I mean, because of my access at the moment, like you mentioned at the top of my intro, I sit on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So this was something, that because of that access, because of that privilege, I definitely brought into those spaces because, it's not, it's kind of complicated with this, idea of like church and state, but, at least to make these issues aware that, that it is very silencing. It is harming our people to have, us invisibilized in these moments. And so definitely sharing those concerns with that kind of audience. But also just trying to outsmart these platforms as best we can, and organizing together to really, share our concerns and really our frustration with these companies.
Yeah, Instagram ended up giving an apology, but they said it wasn't anything different than what they were doing to anybody else, which, whether we want to believe that or not.
I think something. Yeah, I think something else was happening like globally that day, like other kind of uprisings. So it was a very auspicious moment of like, why is all this content being erased from the platform? Is very, very red flag.
So, and the U.S. election too brought up things like even words like education or Black or Indigenous or like climate were kind of being throttled through that time because it deemed to be political activism. But I'll talk a little bit. We'll pull that out, and you just need to have somebody who's experienced with that back end to know the tricks to kind of get around that. But let's talk about tips before we end this. We're a little bit over, but enjoying this a lot. What are tips to define our own audience and interest groups? Is there any tips that you use to kind of define your interest groups and where they're at?
Yeah, for us in our work, it's easy to say, like when we're designing an impact strategy or campaign, it's easy to say Indigenous peoples. At the same time, that's pretty broad, and we get really specific with our audiences, and it makes it that much more fun because you get to get really nuanced about where you're placing media or content, and even the type of media or content that you're creating. So, for instance, we're building materials around breaking down like all of these different climate proposals and plans, Green New Deal, Thrive. There's so many of them. And while
example of some words, keep going with some words that you use to define interest.
Chapter houses.
Fossil fuel,
tribal council. Oh, sorry.
Like what, fossil fuel, or do you define it by clean energy or things like that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But so like when we're narrowing in on an audience, so the point I'm getting at with this, with our work to build education and climate literacy, we're thinking of like, okay, how can we get media and content into like IHS, which is Indian Health Services clinics? So, the families that are going in there can be seeing the content in those spaces. And then also identifying like Native youth and where they're hanging out and what tools they're using, and the types of words and things that resonate with them. Skoden, Studis, those types of things.
Yeah, so you're getting more and more defined as you're actually identifying where people are at, and then defining their interests, and then what will like hook them.
Yeah, and the type of language and messaging that'll hook them. Yes, yes, 100%.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So I just want to say, like, digital's beyond borders. Why do you think an international audience is important? And I think we're going to have to ask the audience if they have any question. We're running a bit over today, but this is exciting stuff. So why do you think an international audience is important when we're talking about Canada, US, Mexico, defining even beyond that?
Yep. Is that question for me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think just simply put, to demonstrate that we're building truly networked, decolonized power, that we can't be stopped by colonial borders or like geographies, and when it comes and yeah, that we're organized, that we're able to build power together across, across these lands and territories, when it comes to dismantling, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy.
Thank you. It's really important. I think our media does, it resonates with so many more people than we think with just one country or just one province or state. So thanks for all that work on that. So is there, I'm going to ask if there's any time for questions. Do we have, can we ask Jade a question from the audience if we have one? All right. How do you pull this marketing off with a shoestring budget? What is some advice for gathering resources around this kind of work? That's a really great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think one that we really come up against as grassroots frontline media makers. So I think, and this was shared earlier too, having basic tools like a cell phone and like a selfie stick, like these types of tools are really all you need to produce fairly good content, especially if you're doing like rapid response, or I've seen some pretty good short films filmed on the iPhone, or a smartphone. So I think it's not being a part of it is not being limited or confined by what you have access to. So yeah, even if it's just your smartphone, just really like committing to that type of tool and learning the different apps that you can download. There's so many now, and a lot of them are free. So that's a part of it. And then not being individualistic about this work. I've done so much work by being able to ask for help, whether that's like asking friends to come collaborate, or reaching out across social media to someone who I think makes amazing content, and or who has been producing really cool media. Is there a way to collaborate with them, or is there a way to join forces? I think being collaborative is really key in this type of work. And then I think for like NGOs or organizations, just not being worried about asking for a big comms budget. I've worked in many Native and Indigenous organizations in the past, and I think that's something that we don't prioritize, which is a big mistake, because half of advocating, half of like campaign building is narrative work. And so really like knowing that it's really important to advocate for yourself and ask for a good budget when it comes to your communications and narrative work. Those are like 3 off the top of my head.
That's great. Those answers are great, and they apply to filmmakers, media makers, people who are using media in so many different ways. So we definitely need to have your line items to have media communications, digital strategy. You definitely have to have for marketing, promotion. And then using a selfie stick and a cell phone even counts to the red carpet when you're making assets and making content for yourself. So always things to capture, and the more assets, the more material, the more you have to engage with people. So thank you so much for your time here, Jade. And I'm just putting people can follow you by going to Twitter @_Jade Begay, and on Instagram @Jade the Mighty, and also see their content at NDN Collective. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Today. Always a pleasure. Thanks
you so much for having me. Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So you have those tips now about media strategy and digital comms and digital strategy, and how it sort of intersects with different things that we're doing in media. I just think it's wonderful, because a lot of these terms and stuff are starting to be influence film and film marketing and what we're doing. We're going to go back to Marylou Mintram now for part 2 and talk to her a bit more about her role as a producer and writer and how this sort of integrates thinking about strategy and planning. So if Marylou back here, thanks for coming back. I'm going to go straight into it. So why is strategy or planning important to think about while making films or media? Because now you're doing TV and films and producing all these things under Rainstorm Productions. Why is strategy or planning important at this and your role?
In the same way that you approach making a movie or a television show, short film, any type of content, the approach of marketing that product with a clear plan and your focus at the end goal, that this will help you to be consistent in aligning every piece of your film marketing with that end goal in mind too, right? So just because you made the project doesn't mean that it ends there. Like, it continues, it takes on another life of its own. And to be able to start by determining who is your target audience. Who do you want to go see this project? Who do you want to impact? Where do you want your film to be seen and be talked about in those places and spaces? Right? Build profiles of your ideal target audience.
Yeah,
and consider what that is.
Yeah,
I think gone are the days of, oh, this film's going to be for everybody, from this demographic, from this age to this age, right? So we need to get out of that type of mindset, and because audiences from different demographics have different preferences, right? So we need to know what those are and what they're. Tailor your film marketing to them individually. This target approach is known as one-to-one marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And being aware of how effective that type of marketing is. Because there's psychology behind social media. There's psychology behind how effective we are on these platforms. Understanding the time that they spend and where they spend on these platforms.
Yeah, which is psychodemographics, which is another word we're going to have to break down for you, which just means a demographic that is based by interest and psychology and sort of behavior, as opposed to just age and gender, which we're going beyond now.
Exactly. And to add to that understanding of the psychodemographics, being aware of where they are, right? Where are they? How are you going to connect with that demographic?
And the messaging that changes between each of those demographics too.
Right, exactly.
I have the example from Parasite and how it made it to the Oscars. They had 27 different movie posters to get that out to different audiences. Like, we need to think about assets and sort of massaging it. And those things are cheaper nowadays because we all have computers. So those assets are easier to design or change messaging or make custom, right? Yeah.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag. I apologize.
There is a lag, sorry. But what is important, Marylou, to have on hand, and what is important to have on hand for content, these assets we're talking about, after you're done completing your project? Just take us through some that you'd like to have.
This is a perfect question, because I think as filmmakers or content creators with our projects, we forget, if I build it, they will come. If I build my film and have it ready, people will want to see this film. And forgetting about the assets building takes place when you start shooting, right? Because take advantage of the cast that you have there and the excitement that they're expressing to you, saying, "Oh, I'm so thrilled to be part of this project. This is what it means for me." Capture that. That's going to help you with your film, as well as your people who are making it happen, because it is a collaborative effort. And I really loved and echo what Jade was saying and previously on how, for us bias and being aware of the collective approach of everyone putting their sweat equity into the project, right? So people are passionate about it and passionate about making it. Capture that, get those assets. And then that way, when you come to promoting it at your various festivals, and being specific to targeting the geolocations, right, of that place where it's going to be shown. Be specific on how you're connecting with people there so that they know, oh, it's being shown here at this festival, or this discussion is going to happen. And, you know, so it's really tailoring your content to meet that demographic.
So you're mentioning sort of collecting it with your talent and the people behind the scenes. So these are BTS, or behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you like to capture more than others? And then I'm going to ask you sort of, we're going to get into the wearing different hats and kind of thinking about marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to build a timeline. Roll out your film marketing plan. Be smart about how you're going to release content when, because when you're looking at data and analyzing your audience, you can find out when they're active, where they're active on these various platforms, and how to be strategic and when you post, so you can get that activity happening.
Yeah, those peak times.
Exactly.
We're looking, and different demographics look at different times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how you build your audience, and that's how you build engagement, and that's important as well. At looking at trying to build a presence for your film. And marketing doesn't have to be an expensive exercise, although you put money into it. but you can bootstrap it, right? You can build a plan that doesn't compromise on your cohesive style too, like making posters too, and like as you gave an example.
Yeah, sorry. Excuse me, I just sneezed. So how do you find being a producer different from being from marketing films? Like, what are the takeaways you can use now by wearing those different hats in your career?
Well, they both are very, very different roles. And as a producer, looking at my project or production, I'm trying to be cognizant of the audience of who we're trying to connect with, and building a marketing plan right from development, right? Understanding who they are, and building the plan, and I think that's also, as producers, when we're connecting and applying for financing and funding, a lot of funders are also looking at a marketing plan right from the point of development, right? Yeah. So it's important to know how to put together a really strategic plan to show that you do have an audience, that you do have people who want to see this film.
I'm going to, we're going to be running out of time. But I still really want to talk to you about sort of our own communities in Indigenous film marketing. Our films are just making theatrical, or just making broadcast, they're kind of getting to these places, they're going international. It's wonderful, but what do our communities right now, do you think, our filmmaker marketing communities, what do you think maybe we need to catch up on, or we don't understand about this new world, especially with this disruption now during COVID? So what do we not, what do our own people maybe not understand about the film marketing world, which we've been kept out of? There's been barriers and reasons why.
Right, yeah. I think your film, looking at being cognizant of your messaging, aligning yourself with that relevant subject matters that connects your film to your audience is important, and making sure that you are providing those authentic opportunities for engagement, and the impacts of social media. Sometimes there are short spurts, right? And knowing how to tailor your engagement is important, so it's not lost because just as easily as you do a post, it can be gone the next day, right? So to stay relevant on those trends is important. Staying aware and those practices of analytics is important, because you can adjust, right? So once you can collect that data and quantify it, knowing what those KPIs are, those key performance indicators, then you can adjust. You can make adjustments. You know what's working, what's not working.
Yeah, you can see if somebody likes photos over like GIFs or media clips. You can see if they like video interviews with the cast as opposed to just putting, you know, news up, or they actually like talking about social issues more than in the movie, maybe than some of the fun stuff with the comedy. So you're always kind of looking at and getting
on top of that. Yeah.
Let's
So
talk about
you might have a shift in your planning midway. And I think that's good. I think that's good because you are showing that your audience and you are social listening, right? So social listening and social monitoring goes hand in hand to the planning and the implementation too. So, and implementing your social media.
Thank you for bringing up social listening too. It's important. That's an important part of engagement. Nobody talks about it, but you're listening. And sometimes, you know, like at Stories First, we have a policy of always answering every single question in our feeds. People don't. They don't have time, or the full-time people. But social listening, then you can decide what to do if people ask you questions or want to interact or want to engage in a different way. But you're also social listening by seeing the data of what they're consuming, if it's like GIFs or pictures or video, or what that specific audience looks like. How can you talk a bit about discoverability? I think that we need to kind of break down, like, that means like how to find you online. And I think that that's something that we haven't talked about. People are surprised about that we need to build SEO.
And what is SEO?
So you can define that and then talk about it being discoverability, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as important as creating your persona, your audience persona, which is like your snapshot of the audience that you want to connect with, equally as important is oh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I'm trying to make sure I define what they are, as well as explaining the impacts.
Got it.
Yeah. But also looking at, can you ask me the question one more time?
SEO. So talk a bit, let's just define what that word is. You can tell us words. And then we'll talk about online discoverability, especially during this disruption now where everything's online.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good to be aware of how that is what SEO is, and how are we being on top of the Google, right? When we're Googling things, or when we're on your search engines, or on when you put something in Facebook or whatever, those keywords, right? So how are we looking at connecting with our audiences, and how can they connect with us, right? So we have to be cognizant of the words and the message that we use, and building on how to build on those search engine positions, and how to be effective so you can be, that people can find you.
And so finding is just like having a website and having social. Like some people just think like if I just do a Facebook for my film, it'll be fine. Like what? How do you make it more robust than that? Like what do you usually do when you think about your film? What does your film need?
Well, there's one very effective way that we can see even in Instagram is hashtags, right? Because when you look at hashtags, it's in terms of building on your analytics and reporting, you can look at that hashtag and look at that activity, look at that engagement. So when you connect them and be smart with your hashtags, that can also be like a funnel, right? Funneling to the audience that you're trying to engage in and with, as well as cross multi platforms, right? And being aware that each platform has their own effective way to connect with these groups. So
Yeah,
you might not have,
rules. Yeah.
you might not use the same message or way to connect on Facebook, on Snap, on Instagram, on Twitter, right? So you have to be very cognizant of how those messages are being built across up on each platform.
Yeah, and I'll argue this to the end of time, but you need a website. You need to go to as many social channels that are applicable to your audience group, and we need more is more kind of merrier. I think. Is there any? I mean, to me, more is merrier, but using it effectively is better than more. But I would like to talk to you about any tricks. We're kind of having to skip over and wrap up, but we'll talk about how any tricks that you deal with being throttled and Indigenous content being throttled. And then we'll talk about anything else you think we've left out for approaching marketing.
Throttling. Another word that's also used is shadow ban. Right? How can you protect yourself? And being careful that your post isn't against terms or conditions that a lot of these apps or sites or platforms use. Arguably, they would say, oh, we didn't know, or we're not deliberately doing that. But how to know that you are being shadow banned? And first of all, it can be frustrating to see that you post content and then you can take it down. But you might not agree with that social media algorithm about what's inappropriate or what's not inappropriate, or sometimes they take things down because you're having a constructive debate or constructive dialogue with some others. But the algorithms in these places might think that you're being a troll, right? So, and then that's one of the reasons why they take things down. So it's important to know the tips or guides to help avoid being shadow banned in the future, and you can get better engagement. But I guess the biggest things is don't spam posts, right? So don't be aware of how you, with that tailored approach, be aware of when you post things on your various platforms, don't go spam them. Right? Because then that will also trigger shadow banning, or links that are not allowed, and always treat others with kindness too, and in terms of how you're engaging other people with people who are connecting into your social networks.
Okay, wonderful. I think we're gonna take maybe one question from the audience. You guys, you have any questions for our wonderful speakers, please put them in the chat. We'll either get to them individually or at the end. Okay, one here is regards to the audience demographic that we need to include to our pitches to communicate. Is saying Indigenous people enough? What are the other audiences would you like to know as a former film marketer? So is saying Indigenous people enough on your applications and your marketing form when you're making Indigenous movie for Indigenous people, or do you have to go beyond that? And what do you do personally when you say these things? How do you break it down?
Saying no, it's not enough just to say it's Indigenous, right? You need to a good example of positive Indigenous media marketing that I've seen has been in finding promotional approaches by utilizing social media and digital technologies, and being specific on how to tailor your message to meet your target group. It's not just enough to say you're Indigenous. It's the same thing when you're looking at a film and saying, well, I'm making a film and it's going to be for demographics 25 to 45. Well, what does that mean? Right? Mm-hmm. So know who they are, what their interests are, what motivates them, where they're engaged, right? Because we're different, and different interests, different values and things. So understanding your audience is so important. And when you're looking at Indigenous audience, like that's like a niche, right? A niche is a very specific targeted group. So when looking at your niche group, your niche, if it's Indigenous, then know your audience, know what's important.
So it could be a genre, like they would like, and as an example, it could be a genre film about a rom-com, or
right.
like,
but also know their values, knows what's important to the community that you're trying to connect with, and find ways to engage them, build that relationship, right? It's within our communities. It's, well, where are you from?
Yeah,
you know, it's like that connective piece.
And where are you from, and what do you value? Yeah, right. Those are both amazing points. Thank you, Marylou. I have one more question from the audience for you, and I think that'll be it for this section. But Katya DeBach says, what do you mean by don't spam your own posts? So if you want to define that a bit more.
Yeah. Don't spam your posts. Like when you're preparing your posts for these various places, it's good to not always do duplicates, right? Share it and then tag it, and then it appears on your feed like 5 times, or you tag somebody else, and you know what I mean? Like, don't spam them, because and then people will find that annoying. For one.
So the word spam is sort of like roughshod, or like just distributing the same thing over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. It's amazing because you've been a marketer, you're a producer, writer now. You're doing so many things that are in play, and you have an amazing slate. So we'll be coming back to any other questions from Marylou at the end. But again, thank you so much. Your knowledge in all these areas is very appreciated.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk to now Delphine Lievens, who joins us from London, UK. She's been a marketer for many years, and she's working now for Gower Analytics. And she's here as one of our allies. It's amazing to have her. And we had her on the last program too for BIPOC, for the BIPOC section, and she's come back for the Indigenous one. So thank you so much for your allyship. To you, Delphine, for joining us from a different time zone. And I just wanted to talk to you about basics, because you're doing these analytics every day. You've been doing this work all the way through the pandemic, before the pandemic, during pandemic, and now on to post-pandemic, which you'll be able to see the whole gamut of how things have changed when it comes to marketing in these times, and hopefully back to normal times. Now that we talked about like just Indigenous audiences and some other groups that we can kind of define for their interest base, how do we incorporate sort of more genre-based audiences in film and media, and what do you suggest around including those genres?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, yeah, thank you very much for having me in your space as well. I really appreciate that, and I'm kind of proud and happy to be able to kind of ally and, you know, link. I think someone was talking about joining together for the power of decolonization earlier. I think that was Jade, and I wrote it down because I thought it was a really nice sentiment. But yeah, talking about genre. So I think genre is a really easy and relatable tool for someone, kind of no matter what your level of experience with making content is. Genre is a tool, it's a language that everyone understands. And it's also a good way to take what you've got and think about how you can make it relevant on a global scale. And I think even if there isn't a clear genre there, then obviously, like we were talking about, interest-based as well, thinking about for your film and what sort of interests they might share. In terms of kind of more traditionally, so I work in film, but I think this applies kind of across media and content. More traditionally, marketing was kind of very much split into age, gender, and then in the UK we tend to use class, and in the US it's more about race. But some sort of
class being like Twitter used to have the income of the audience base, just to.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, class basically as kind of essentially means so it's some sort of economic, socio-economic divide.
Yeah.
But the issue, obviously, with that kind of traditional marketing, you're making a lot of assumptions if you're saying that all 25-year-old working class women enjoy the same content. It's just not true. So I think that's why using something like genre is a much more useful tool for kind of growing audiences on a global scale. One of the things that's really important in film, in any kind of film marketing, film audience design, is comps. And what we mean by comps is comparative titles. And the idea behind that basically is finding content, finding films that are comparable to what it is that you want to make. It's not that you're copying those films, but they might have a similar genre, you might have a similar story, a similar outlook. You might have cast members as a crossover that have a social media following already. And what's really good to do is look to those films that are in the same genre, the same space, or look to that content and look at what they're doing to get their audience. What platforms are they using? What networks are they using? What networks are they part of? Can you be part of their networks? And what methods are they using to promote their films? Obviously, assets was mentioned before. So yeah, what sort of assets are they using? And you can also see quite easily on social media whether what they're doing is working as well. So you can take that and it's kind of a free education for yourself in which you can market your content.
Yeah, and in business it would be called like an industry scan, but you're basically doing a film scan, which most people who are doing their pitches should have like 2 or 3 films that their film relates to or feels like. But using this in marketing is useful as well. That's good to know. Is there any? Yeah. Is there any?
I was just going to give a good example. Oh, sorry. Is that what you were going to say? I came across a really good example that from a few years back. I think it was 2016. It's a film called Sami Blood. And it's made by a Sami filmmaker. The Sami people are just peoples of Sweden and Finland. And it's really interesting because I think it's probably the first kind of theatrically released Sami-made film. Anyway. And it had a huge reach all across Europe. And the reason for that is that it was a coming-of-age film. And it followed a very traditional coming-of-age narrative. And that gave it a global storyline that people could relate to and something they've seen on film before. So they were able to use genre and then actually bring an Indigenous narrative to a much wider group of people. At first glance, you would look at that film and think, okay, this is a film that concerns Sami audiences. But actually, or, you know, at a stretch, maybe Sami and, you know, Scandinavian audiences. But actually, it reached all across Europe. And I'm not sure if it reached the States as well, but I think it had a small release in the States. And, you know, that story spoke to people on a global scale. So I think that's kind of, a really kind of inspiring story, that one.
Thank you. That's amazing. And it's good that you're including international people and international audiences in this global scale. Why do you think that's important right now that we include sort of this international or global? I guess even when we're looking at Indigenous work, that seems quite hyper localized. Why do you think it's important to think about global networks? And
I think it's important because of how things have changed. I think we're going to go on to talk a little bit about digital disruption in a moment. And in a nutshell, you know, you will have noticed that over the past 5-10 years, or even the past year, things are constantly developing and our outlook is becoming so much more global, and a global audience has easier access to you. So if that global audience have easier access to you and your content, you might as well exploit the fact that they're there and that you can get across to them. And like I said, you know, you might have a really globally relevant narrative that actually, you know, could speak to people and kind of, it also can really help to obviously highlight the issues your community is facing. It can, you know, like I was saying, the power of kind of coming together to decolonize and dismantle white supremacy. You know, there is a lot of allyship going on amongst kind of different Indigenous and different people of color across the world. And I think it's acknowledging that, you know, there's people out there that are actually, you know, facing similar situations to yourself, and your content could be of interest or of use to them. And, you know, we have the platforms there to do it now. So I think that's why it's important to not limit yourself.
For sure. And you talking about sort of our connectivity all over the world. I was working in film for a long time, and I have to always say to people, like, 80% of the world is some type of brown.
Exactly.
80% of the world is some type of brown. Distributors are like, they, you know, when you have that lens of whiteness all around all the time, that's all you kind of see in your lens. So that to me is a digital disruption to the internet. It being like, whoa, other people exist and have amazing stories and are in the world. But let's talk about the recent digital disruption that I think is emanating and affecting all of our work right now. So let's just define digital disruption first. So maybe.
Yeah. So I think for me, my kind of my very broad definition is how the availability of digital technology has impacted the media industry. So that can be anything from the birth of the internet to us going into a global pandemic and suddenly using the internet as our primary communication tool for the past 18 months or so. So it's when digital technology literally disrupts kind of the status quo, the way that things are normally done.
All right. So we've had thank you for defining so many words that we're trying to tear down and make digestible. But what has digital disruption done for filmmakers and media makers right now, or media artists, or anybody who's can get their digital pieces online?
So I think it's entirely a positive thing. As I kind of mentioned already, it gives you a more global outlook. And what it has done is improved accessibility to audiences. So obviously before, you know, there was a certain global outlook, but I think people are kind of, I mean, things like, for example, this conversation is taking place on the internet.
Yeah.
It's streamed and anyone can watch it worldwide. Normally, this would have been the sort of conversation that took place on a panel at a film festival, for example. So the accessibility, all of a sudden, of any type of online content or media has been hugely widened, which means that you just have a larger pool of audience to pick from, and it's easier to reach them. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversations about representation in the past 12 to 18 months as well, and Lives Matter and things like that. And as cynical as it is, unfortunately, these things can come in waves, and it's good to kind of seize that conversation and make yourself a part of it. And I think the fact that it is happening is really beneficial for people of colour who are media makers at the moment, because there is now a lens on you. And people are kind of actively seeking out your content, which, like I say, it's horribly cynical, but it's worth noting. Also, another kind of conversation that's been going on a lot in the film industry is about broadening audience tastes. So I think actually this conversation started with people trying to kind of pinpoint the success of Parasite, which is something you mentioned earlier, and the suggestion that perhaps people are more open to watching films with subtitles because there's been quite, at least in the UK anyway, an explosion in the popularity of foreign language television content through Netflix. Because obviously Netflix have their local offices where they are producing local content, but they're then putting that out globally, and people are actually watching that globally, probably more than Netflix actually originally expected, which is really interesting. Like there's a French show, Lupin, which is on Netflix, it's really popular here in the UK. So there's been a lot of discussion about kind of broadening audience tastes, I guess, and not assuming that audiences are perhaps as simple or naive as we originally thought. And I think, again, the really good thing about that is the idea that people are open to watching subtitled content. People are open to watching content that's from a culture or a place that's perhaps not their own. They're interested by that. They've had a taste of it. And it's basically because, you know, streaming networks are more prominent now. Watching things online is more prominent. They're seeing what other content is out there. The content that normally you would have to go to an art house cinema to see is now available in a much broader way. And I think that's really important because it's allowing space online for, you know, not just feature films, but even for feature films as well, to kind of be accessed by a much wider pool of people.
Thank you. That's awesome. So you're seeing a lot of opportunities here. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's basically what I'm saying. Is I see a lot of opportunity, and something for people to kind of grasp. And I think, yeah, people are probably just spending more hours on the internet, literally. So in those more hours they're spending is when you're able to kind of hit them with your socials or hit them with content that you're making available for them to watch.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is the last question, then we'll hit. The audience can ask you anything that they would like here, so type in your questions. But can you take us through globally relevant tips and tricks for people making their first media strategies ever? Some of the people online here have done, I'm sure, a few, but to those new people who've never made one before.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously comps, as I mentioned already, comparative titles. Look at what other people are doing. Be present in spaces. Be present on social so that you can see how other people are using it as well, because then you can take that information and incorporate it into your own plans and your own strategy. I think being aware of the potential scale or scope of your project. So like I was saying, obviously there is a global scale for some projects, but also I think people of color have a tendency to confine themselves based on their own fears or internal assumptions, and the feeling that, I mean, when you have been treated as less than or other for so long, it's hard to feel that there's a space for you to now claim that is yours, and you should feel that there is a space now for you to claim that is yours. So I think don't define yourself based on that fear, but also be aware of the world you're putting yourself into, if that makes sense. So yeah, tap into the conversation about representation. I think also, yeah, going back to what I was saying about genre, it's bearing in mind that, unfortunately, I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply so much outside film for other types of media, but for film, definitely. It's a commercial business. You might be making art, but it's a commercial business. So people want to see bankable assets like genre. So if you're able to go to them and say, this is my genre or this is my audience, that would be great. So my next tip would be build your social media presence, build your social media following. It's a really good demonstration of audience that you can get for free, essentially. And you're able to then demonstrate your audience to people. You might be writing funding applications or looking for someone to host your content. And if you can already demonstrate you have that social following, that's really important.
Or partnering with somebody who does is okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another option. And I think along with doing that, you're getting free data, essentially. So we've talked a lot about social analytics, and there's a lot of things, a lot of type of data in the world that you can pay for, not including the software that's from the company I work for. But things like social, things like Google Analytics for your website, that's free. So you can take that data and you can kind of, you might know nothing about data, you might know a bit, but you can experiment with it, you can splice it, you can cut it in different ways, and it's going to give you more than just age and location. Those are the primary things, but it's going to give you more than that. And you can take all of that information from your socials and transfer it into any kind of applications or pitches that you're making.
Okay. And I mean, you've sat down and probably made media strategies plenty of time, but I mean, some people like to start at the end first and then go backwards, or start the goals, objectives first. Is there any place in the strategy, goals, objectives, tactics, and measurement? Is there any place you like to start out with first to kind of get you digging in?
I definitely like to start at the goals and objectives end, because I feel like that guides every other decision that you make. I also think if you are starting from a place of absolutely nothing at all, and this is what we do in film, is you have a brainstorm. Everyone watches the film and then you sit down and, do you have the word brainstorm in Canada? That's not a British word, is it?
Brainstorm, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I never know like what are British terms, but yeah, so we sit down and you've seen the film, and then it's like you can build your goals and objectives so well. Active process like that. So again, if you're working with people, try and be collaborative in the first instance. Once you've been collaborative and everyone's on the same page, then people can kind of split off and start doing their own things, and they can take their own specialisms out from that point. So like I worked a lot with like direct-to-cinema marketing. So that's the kind of specialism I'd take away, but we'd start with shared goals for the whole campaign with everybody. So I think it's a really good place to start.
Yeah, shared goals are important because you can kind of build those objectives so wide enough to fit shared goals, and then sort of breaking down individual objectives. but watching the film is such an important part of the, such an important part of the process. And then you can do like pulling out themes, pulling out social issues, pulling out those audience, brainstorming about where best to go to. That's a really fun place, and that's what makes media strategy fun. We have a couple questions, so we're going to put them up to you. So Magali Boutin says, what are your rules related to non-Indigenous media? Are companies use clips of film on their social platform or in the news without the full context? So I think that's meaning like, what if you're, or do you agree to share the clips? What are your guidelines? So I think sharing clips.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually, in the sense that, I mean, they should also obviously be asking for permission. So I assume we're in a theoretical situation here where they have actually asked for permission to share and not just taking it. It's a really difficult one, and it's really interesting you bring this up because I have started doing kind of more, I did TV once, I've done some newspapers, and it's really interesting how you can talk to someone for half an hour and they'll take one thing you said out of context and that's all they take, and you don't have very much control over that. What I would say is do your research. Who's asking for the clip?
Yeah.
If you know who they are and they know they align to your audience and you know they're respectful, fantastic. Because there are non-Indigenous, non-people of colour, white organisations out there who are very good allies. And unfortunately, the world we live in is that most media companies are run by predominantly white people still currently, and they could be a really good ally. So I think it's, if it's someone you know is a good ally who's demonstrated they're a good ally, then fantastic, go for it. It could really help broaden your reach. If you are not so sure, you're not aware of them, it might be that they're quite small, they're starting out, so then you kind of need to use gut feeling a bit more. But if it's someone who you just get a bad vibe from, or you can see that they've shared other content without context, or you can see that, they're perhaps journalistic, don't have much journalistic integrity, or whatever it might be, I would say definitely trust your gut. And it's really tempting to say yes to everything, but occasionally, obviously, things can get misrepresented or taken out of context. And it's really unfortunate. And also just assert yourself in the process as much as you can, but I've learned that it's easier said than done. So make sure that, when you're making the initial agreement, perhaps you ask for a final clearance or something like that.
That's really good advice for working with partners or anybody who wants to come in, who has good intentions, and also just doing your homework on them and where they place themselves in sort of the social sphere. Thank you for that. And then I'm going to ask you, which was a question that was popped up on the screen before. What is your advice to somebody that feels like strategy or planning is daunting, who just wants to concentrate on making the film or the media piece here? They just want to concentrate on the art, making the film, being an auteur. It could, I guess, feel really daunting. So what would you tell them?
Absolutely get it. And I think, working in film or working in media, you basically spend your entire life balancing art and commerce. So firstly, there's a level of acceptance in doing that. I definitely came into it very naive, thinking, that I cared about art, and then very soon became someone who knew a lot and cared a lot about commerce. And naturally, working in strategy, working in marketing, you do end up leaning more towards the kind of commercial side of things. So obviously, if you've decided you are literally just making art for art's sake and commercial gain is not important to you, then fantastic. If you want to have a little bit more reach and you're not making it just for yourself, I think, yes, data and strategy and planning can be really daunting, but it's acknowledging that it's going to benefit you in the long run. Some people kind of use that kind of fake it until you make it process, and I would advise that to a certain extent, in the sense that I would say from my experience with, I hope there's no funders on here, there might be funders on here, but my experience is that funders sometimes don't even know what they're looking for, and you need to bring them what they are looking for, and they might ask certain questions, but realistically it's what's at the core of your project. So if they're asking questions that you feel like they're shutting you out, I think it's okay to flag that to them. I think it's okay to say, like, I don't know how to respond to this question, or I would respond to this question in this way, or can we talk about what your intentions are by asking me this question? Because I think unfortunately, we have these kind of white lens funding organizations that are asking people really difficult questions sometimes, and it really then shuts out the less experienced filmmakers, the Indigenous filmmakers, those who perhaps didn't have access to film school and things like that. So anything you can do to kind of create a dialogue there and show audience, I mean, you still need to have something to show, but if you need to show it in your own way, then you can approach it like that. That's a very broad comment. Obviously, I don't know much about funding applications in Canada, but assuming it's like the UK, that's quite a small industry, people are always open to kind of human to human conversation. And then Leena can interrupt me in a minute and say if that's all right. And yeah, like I said, decide if you want to be commercial. And also the age old, you learn from your mistakes, try things.
Yeah.
I basically blagged my way into the job I have now by saying I had an advanced knowledge of Excel. I don't. You can Google anything you need to do in Excel.
You can.
So, like that.
Yeah. But
if you've got common sense, you'll work it out.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, some of those formulas, come on, they're a little hard. No,
yeah, absolutely. But
media strategy does come with knowledge, though, and I don't want to downgrade that.
I'm not downplaying it, but I'm saying it's like you can teach yourself.
You can.
Don't feel that you're shut out because someone hasn't taught you.
Yeah.
Go out there and find the tools to teach yourself. That's what I'm trying to do, not that it is.
Yeah. And we'll be offering some more in-person sessions on hopefully media strategy too. I'll be sending out, if people would like to send out an email to me, I'd be happy to send the first 5 questions I get anybody to ask themselves when they're making their own media strategy. We have one more question here. Terrence Alanis says, in your perspective, how does marketing media content differ from marketing any other product or service? It's a good question.
It's a really good question. And I have to use this analogy that someone gave me, because basically we were talking about film, but I think it applies to all media. The space that your product is on the shelf in the shop, i.e. your media, is so much shorter than anything else. If you are making a new type of water, for example, you're going to be in those supermarkets for, like, you know, they'll give you a trial period of like 3 months, 6 months. People can see it there. A film, if it's in cinemas, is in the cinema for 4 weeks. If you're on streaming, you're in the newly added list for maybe 2 weeks if you're lucky. You have a really short period of time in which to get people in. And this goes directly against that whole don't spam your audience, and don't spam your audience. But recognize when you're in that period, you're in that window, that you're new and you can catch people. There will always be people who come further down the line, and some types of media are more what we call long tail than others. Long tail basically just means it's still garnering audience interest further down the line. So knowing if you have an idea, again, look at your comps. Our audience is going to engage straight away. Is it going to take longer to win them? But also just bearing in mind that it's like the newer your product, people are always looking for new media now. The newer your product, the more it's going to stand out. So use that time effectively, because you don't get the same kind of time on the shelf or in the shop window, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an amazing analogy to compare it for like release time and to make people aware of this. Also, when I talk to people who are distributing to Canada or US audiences, I'm just going to add a little bit to this. I know we're way over time. We'll wrap up probably in the next 5 minutes, very speedily. And I always tell people the runway counts too. So if you're reaching niche audiences or these IBPOC, BIPOC, or racialized audiences, it takes a lot of time to get through sort of the white marketing and white media too, to get to our communities. The grassroots takes a long time to go deeper to those grassroots. So runways for these media strategies, to me, as I said, I've talked to US distributors, for like Latinx or Black or LGBTQ films, they take like 7 months, sometimes 5 to 7 months to kind of build your audience. And then there's that really quick window of 2 months release of like film festival, theatrical, and then maybe online streaming. So you're building your mountain. You're kind of building your the path to the top of the mountain for a bit of time. Is there anything you want to say around?
No, I just absolutely agree. That's absolutely how it is, building that path to the and then you come very like sharply down.
Yeah, and I find people come to me when they already are in film festival and they're already have their theatrical date, and I'm like,
it's too late.
Did you build the mountain yet?
Yeah, exactly.
Your 4 social platforms, your website, your ideas around hashtags or your social issues, your themes, because we have to build all of that before you go to the shop window. So,
exactly.
Okay, so we're running 10 minutes over, but it's been such a good conversation. Thank you, Delphine. If there's no more audience questions, I'm just going to go over a few of the things that we can see in our Canadian grants now that you guys might need to think about. Or maybe I can, I just want to say a few things about thinking about your grants, and then we'll end the session. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's later for you, and
no, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate your time always. So I just want to kind of go over to some people who are still left. Thank you for being here. I know we're over, but I'm going to ask the tech to put some different quotes from grants and grant applications in Canada that you might want to think about when you're doing it. So just a couple of examples of where places you need to define your audience or define your discoverability. So the Bell Fund here is identifying your audience or segments of the project and targeting demographic data, age, gender, geolocation is essential. Try to add insights about their interests, lifestyle, values, media consumption habits. You can see with Bell Fund, you actually need to know all these things. And there's other examples by Shaw Rocket Fund. There's other examples by the CMF. Rogers is here. Tell us about the intended audience for your project and how you intend to reach that audience once your project is complete. So a lot of this stuff is now in every single grant. So it's really important to think about these things. I just want to offer anybody, if you need to, I have this top 5 questions to ask yourself when you're making a strategy. I'll give out to anybody. If you'd like to email us, you can do it at info@Cool.World. If you could put that up there, our email address. info@Cool.World. And we'd like to acknowledge the support of Canada Council and the Arts for the Salon Series. In this event, we also like to thank, of course, our guests and their organizations, ImagineNATIVE, NDN Collective, Gower Street Analytics, Rainy Storm Productions for the important work that they all do for our communities. And thank you for contributing your time and insights today. As well, of course, we would like to thank everyone behind the scenes that made this happen. Della Haddock, Melissa James, Cameron Lee, Darcy Hamilton, Sandy Haxey, and our fellow Cool.World founders, Kat Dodds, Jen Evans, and David Griffith. For more information about upcoming webinars and screenings and how to become involved with our campaigns, please go to Cool.World join us. Sorry, Cool.World/join us. And we'll be sending out a feedback form very shortly. Please let us know what you thought of today's event. Our next webinar, please tune in for June 30th, Digital Democracy and Sovereignty. It'll be co-presented with Squeeze CMM, featuring co-founders of Tech Reset Canada, Jen Evans, Sadia Mozaffar, Bianca Wiley, discussing how increasing software is mediating our reality and how our underinvestment in tech by governments is creating inequity. You can also register at Cool.World/salon. Thank you, everyone, for your time today and being here. I hope you learned some things, and it'll be up for the recording will be up on YouTube and other places for you to revisit.